Welcome back to Boys Back in Class. We're on to chapter 14, The Three Plans. In the movies, people who go on a top secret mission always have lots of fun gadgets and maps and ropes, and sometimes even wear a cool hat. When you're 9 and over 3/4, though, you have to go to school every day. Rescue missions are a lot harder. Especially when you don't know where the people you want to rescue are, and you have to hide everything you're doing from the person you're going on the mission for. But even though we didn't have any gadgets or ropes or hats, we spent every break time and lunchtime and home time trying to think up new ideas that might help Ahmet find his family quickly. By Thursday morning, Tom and Josie and Michael had each come up with a plan, but I hadn't been able to think of anything. "Don't worry," said Josie. "You can help us to see if our ones will work." I tried to smile, but it didn't make me feel any better. On the way to school, we went through all the plans. Tom's went first. He said he should write to the Prime Minister to tell her to keep the gates open until Ahmet had found his family. He had even gotten the address of the Prime Minister's house from his dad and written out the letter. This is what it said. "Dear Prime Minister, we heard from some people on the bus that the government was going to lock the gates so that no more refugees could come in. But our friend Ahmet is a refugee boy. You might have heard about him because he's famous for beating up Brendan the bully, and he doesn't know where his mum and dad are and needs to find them. Please, Prime Minister, can you keep the gates open so that he can find them and so that he can be happy again? Thank you." I thought it was a good idea, and so did Josie, but Michael said it wouldn't work because the Prime Minister was in charge of the government and had probably been the one who told the security guards to lock the gates and send them her special keys. So we couldn't ask her for any help at all. Then Josie talked about her plan, which was called the Special Appeal. She said we should ring a newspaper and tell them all about it, because her mum and dad were always complaining about how many special appeals there were for charities in their newspapers. And once the appeal went out, Ahmet's mum and dad would see it and get in touch. Josie had written the special appeal out and made it as short as possible so that the newspapers could print it quickly. This is what it said. Special Appeal. Please, everyone, a boy called Ahmet, who is in Nelson School, ran away from Syria because of bombs and lost his mum and dad too. If you see a man and a woman who looks like this is their son or your Ahmet's mum and dad, please ring Mrs. Khan on the telephone number at our school, which is below. We need to find Ahmet's family before the gates are locked, which is why this appeal is so special. We all liked the special appeal plan, but then Tom said that even if we did put the appeal in the newspaper would only be sold in England, and Ahmet's mum and dad and anyone who might have seen them would never see it. He knew because when he lived in America, he only ever saw American newspapers, and that's what it must be like in all the countries of the world too. Then Michael told us about his plan. We should write to the High Court, to the judge sitting in the highest chair in the land, and ask them to order all the security guards to open the gates when they see Ahmet's mum and dad, he whispered. It's called an appeal too. I've heard my mum and dad talking about them because her law firm are always doing them for people. I'd ask her how to help Ahmet, but she's always complaining about how much work she has to do, and she charges hundreds of pounds an hour. Well, we can't afford that, cried out Tom. I know, replied Michael, rolling his eyes, which is why I'm saying we should do the appeal ourselves. Is it an appeal like my newspaper one? Asked Josie. Sort of, except it's for a judge. All we need to do is find out who the highest judge in the land is, and write to them, replied Michael. We could even send them your appeal, he said, giving Josie a nudge on the arm. We'd only need to change it a little bit. Mum's always saying that judges have nothing better to do than read appeals all the time. We were excited about this idea the most, as no one could think of anything that might be wrong with it. We decided to go to the school library at home time to find out the name of the highest judge in the land. So, when the last bell rang, we told Ahmet we had to get home quickly so he wouldn't follow us, and headed straight there. Our school library isn't as big as the one Mum works in, but it has larger windows and lots more sunlight, which means you can see all the books better. Mrs. Finicky is our librarian. She always wears bright coloured clothes and bright red lipstick, and you don't even ever have to look for her because she's always standing behind the library counter. I like Mrs. Finicky because she always gets excited when you ask her anything. She tells people off for not looking after their books properly, just like Mum. She has a large sign on the counter that says, "Books are like people. Look past their covers and they'll take you on a great adventure." I like it because it's fun to imagine people as books and guess about what kinds of adventures they might take you on. When we got to the library counter, we all looked up at Mrs. Finicky, who was wearing a sky blue top and sky blue skirt, and Mrs. Finicky smiled and looked down at all of us and said, "Hello, and how can I help you all today?" Tom and Josie and me all looked over at Michael and waited, so he asked, "Miss, do you know where we can find out who the highest judge in the land is? We need to find out for homework." "Really?" said Mrs. Finicky, frowning. We all nodded. Mrs. Finicky scratched her chin. I think we'll have to look online for that, she said, and she started typing into her computer. We nodded and waited excitedly for an answer as Mrs. Finicky narrowed her eyes and looked at the screen. After a few seconds she said, "Here we go. Right. Was it the name of the Lord Chief Justice you were after, or the High Court Judge for the Family Division?" We all looked at each other and then Michael said, "Family Division, please." Mrs. Finicky wrote the name on a piece of paper. When she gave it to Michael, we all looked over his shoulder and read, "H.C. Family Division, Dame Leslie Williamson." "Anything else?" said Mrs. Finicky. Josie said, "Does it have her address there, miss?" Mrs. Finicky frowned again. "Her address?" she asked. "You have to send a letter to her as part of your homework." We all nodded. "So that it gets to her by tomorrow," I added. "It's the High Court of Justice you'll be needing to write to," said Mrs. Finicky, narrowing her eyes at the computer screen again as she copied it down. "But even if you post it today and it gets to her office tomorrow or on Saturday, remember that the courts are closed over the weekend, so that it won't be the judge who gets your envelope. She'll have a secretary to open her mail for her." She handed the slip of paper with the address on to Josie. "Anything else?" She looked at our downcast faces. "I'm sure she'll read your letter eventually," she added gently. "It might just take a while." We left and gathered in the hallway outside. "What are we going to do now?" asked Josie. Her face was all pink, which is what happens when she's really upset. "Even if we send the judge that appeal right away, the gates will be shut before she even gets it. It's already Thursday, and after this weekend is over, we'll only have 5 more days." We all looked at Michael, who shrugged and looked at the floor. "We've got to think of another idea," said Tom urgently. We all nodded, but I felt sick inside. I was scared that Ahmet's family wouldn't be found in time. We were all silent on the bus ride home that afternoon. Everyone was thinking hard, but I could tell from all of our faces that none of us had come up with anything. I felt the worst, because at least everyone else had thought of something. I hadn't come up with a single plan. Now I know it was because my brain just wasn't ready to think of anything then. It wouldn't be ready until the weekend. But when it was, it came up with a plan so fantastic that nobody could ever say no to it. Not even a judge sitting in the highest chair in the land. Chapter 15. The Greatest Idea in the World. That Thursday night, whilst Mum was at work, instead of doing my homework, I took my Tintin pencil case and my exercise book and went and sat down by the window in the kitchen. I wanted to come up with a plan just like Tom and Josie and Michael had done, and thought that if I sat there, maybe my brain would come up with something exciting all on its own. I have a desk in my room, but I like sitting in the kitchen more because then I can see the sky and the whole city too. Tom says it doesn't matter how big or small a flat is. If it's on the top floor, it becomes a penthouse. That's kind of like a house that movie stars live in. I guess they must like sitting in kitchens and looking at skies and cities too. I waited a long time for my brain to think of something, but when Mum came home she found me still sitting at the kitchen table, pressing the Snowy and Captain Haddock buttons on my pencil case. I couldn't think of anything, not even after she came and sat with me to watch the sunset. I love watching the sunset with Mum. She calls it the magic hour because you can see the colours that you won't ever see again, and birds that might fly away forever, swimming across the skies together. But I can only ever do it properly with Mum. I've tried to watch the sunset on my own and feel just as happy, but I can't seem to do it at all. It just doesn't work. By dinner time, I still hadn't thought of anything, so I went straight to bed to see if my brain could think of things better when it was lying down. But I fell asleep instead, and had a nightmare that was so scary it made me wake up. I had dreamt of being on a piece of wood in the middle of a dark sea. At first it had been quiet, but then to my right a girl had begun to cry. She was about to be swallowed by a giant whale, and suddenly on my left my dad was shouting for help from a sinking boat, and no matter how hard I tried or how much I wanted to, I couldn't help the girl or stop my dad from disappearing into the water. If you've ever woken up from a nightmare when it's pitch black and so late that nothing in the world is awake, you'll know that it isn't nice at all. When I woke up I couldn't hear anything or see anything, so for a moment I wasn't sure if I was awake or still in my nightmare. But then I heard one of the mice squeaking in the kitchen, and I knew I was awake. That's the good thing about animals. They always let you know they're around, especially when they're hungry. And if they're around, then you know you're real, and the world around you is real too. I was feeling hot and damp, so I got up and pulled back the covers to make sure I hadn't wet the bed. Luckily I hadn't. I hate wetting the bed. I used to do it all the time after my dad died, but then when I turned 7, something happened, and I stopped doing it. Maybe when you turn 7, your body knows you've become too old to wet the bed anymore. I didn't want to lie back down in case I had the nightmare again, so I tiptoed into the kitchen to get a glass of water and see the mice. Mum says years ago that an old woman who bred all sorts of exotic animals used to live in our flat. That could be why we found a small nest of bright yellow snakes in our kitchen wall last summer, or why we have 2 mice living with us. But I don't mind. I like mice because they make good friends. For a tiny piece of food, they can become your friends for life. They disappear if they don't like you, so you always know if they're going to be your friends right from the start. And it's always good to know from the start, because it saves you from wasting your best cheese. After I got a drink of water, I went back to my room, but I was still too scared to go back to sleep, so I sat on the floor and got one of my favourite Tintin comics out from underneath my bed. It was the one about a rich old opera singer who comes to stay with Captain Haddock, even though he really doesn't want her to, and whose green diamond gets stolen. I couldn't really concentrate on the story because all I could think about was Ahmet and his sister Syrah being in the sea. But then, just as I was thinking about how the rich old opera singer looked like the Queen, except with a much bigger nose, it suddenly happened. I had it. An idea. And it was, without doubt, quite possibly, the greatest idea in the world. It leapt right into my head like a giant frog and jumped around until I knew it had to work. It just had to. You can always tell when you've had a greatest idea in the world because it pops up from nowhere. Ordinary ideas take an awfully long time to become an idea because, well, they're ordinary, so your brain can't get excited about them and has to make them slowly, like thousands of boring bread rolls being baked in an extra slow oven. But when an idea is truly great, it doesn't take any time at all. It suddenly just appears and makes your eyes go wide and your brain feel as if it's been pushed out of your bed. Jumping to my feet, I got out my exercise book and drew out my plan. This is what the greatest idea in the world looked like. When I had finished, I stared at it and went over it again and again in my head. I knew right away that it would work, but only if Tom and Josie and Michael helped and kept it all a secret. I got back into bed and lay there, wishing for the morning to come, because as soon as it did, I was going to put the greatest idea in the world into action and help Ahmet find his family. I knew it was going to be the most exciting thing any of us had ever done, and there was a chance it might get us into trouble too. What I didn't know was just how dangerous an adventure it was going to be, and quite how much trouble it was going to get us into.